We're very excited today to have Professor David Deming from Harvard here to talk about inequality. So we'll turn it over to him. We'll be done at 11:50.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I know it's a busy beginning of the semester. So this is, I'm going to try to give you, so I teach a class at Harvard called The Causes and Consequences of Inequality. It's a big survey course about economic inequality, and we sort of do a couple of classes of overview and then have one class that's on different topics. So we'll cover immigration, we'll cover education and technology, and cover early childhood education, top wealth inequality, all that kind of stuff, sort of one class per topic. There's no way I could do all that today, so I thought that I would give you just kind of, if I could condense it all into one class and give you like the big picture, bottom line takeaway, what would it look like? And that was my attempt here. So we'll see how it goes. This is a class that's taught in the economics department and also at the Kennedy School as well. So and touches on a lot of issues that maybe you've heard a little bit about in some of your classes. I'm going to try to bring some of it together. And I'm used to giving presentations in economics audiences, which means I'm used to getting interrupted. So I would be pleased to take questions throughout if you have them. You don't have to ask them, but I'm happy to. So, okay. All right, so here's the plan. Here's how I want to start. I want to start, as I like to do, with something like this, by giving you the very, very long run, very big picture perspective on economic inequality. Inequality is something that is on the tips of all policymakers' tongues. You read lots of articles about it everywhere. It's sort of the defining social issue of our times, at least in the US. But I think in order to understand it, you really have to take a long-run perspective. So I want to do that. And then I want to, after showing you some evidence from the super long run, I want to kind of pivot to where this all started, which is somewhere around the 1970s, when all of the statistics we use to describe economic inequality start to increase. And one of the challenges about trying to understand this issue is that everything's happening at the same time. We have big cuts in top marginal tax rates at the same time that we have globalization, at the same time we have the decline of unions and worker bargaining power, and all those things are happening at once. So the question is, what caused what? It's really hard to say because we have lots of competing explanations and only one fact pattern. And so when you're studying a complex issue like this, part of the skill is to try to sort of hold multiple competing explanations in your mind at the same time and think like, what is the contribution of each of them? And so I want to sort of give you a little flavor of that, and in particular focus on kind of what I think of as two sorts of separate issues. One is about kind of most people, the bottom 99% of the income distribution, and then a very different set of issues at the very top. And then I want to just give you a little global flavor, because I do think it's important not to be too US-centric. And then finally, I want to talk particularly about some work I'm doing in higher education and how this relates to economic mobility and how this kind of specific issue fits into the broader picture. Okay? All right. So long run, things are getting better. Okay? They're actually getting a lot better. And this is from a figure. I'm going to show you a couple like this from a wonderful website called ourworldindata.org. assembled by Max Roser and colleagues at Oxford. They basically just take data from multiple sources and produce a bunch of narratives around what's happening in the long run with life expectancy and mortality, what's happening with economic growth. And they're great tools for understanding the world around us. So this is one figure from that. What he's showing you is some efforts by a number of scholars to calculate, going back 200 years, the share of all of the global population that is living in poverty. Okay, what you see here is in the orange line, you see, according to this paper by Bourguignon and Morrison, computing since 1820 the share of all citizens in the world living on essentially what is less than $2 per day. Okay, and you can see that's gone from almost everybody in the 1820s, 94%, living on less than $2 a day, down to 52%. And moreover, most of that decrease has happened pretty recently, actually. So if you just look at share of people living in poverty, not that much progress over the first 100 years of the figure. You're going from 94% to something like 80%, which is not nothing. But then you see a dramatic drop in poverty. If you look at the share living in extreme poverty, you see that's even more true. And if you just take a step back and think about what's required to produce a figure like this, well, first of all, how do we have data on how people lived 200 years ago? And how do we kind of figure out what it means to live on $2 a day in a world where $2 went a lot farther? So there's a lot of complex calculations going into measuring inflation, measuring people's living standards. What they're essentially doing is saying, what is the minimum standard of life by which you can get by? What does it cost to buy that minimum standard in terms of a bundle of goods? So food to eat, shelter, a roof over your head, clean water, and so forth. And then trying to figure out what that costs in each year, and then kind of stringing it together to figure out a rise in kind of absolute living standards. Okay. So you want to think about it actually as like, what could I buy for $2 a day right now in the US? Not a lot, right? And that's conceptually the measure of poverty that they have. And what they're telling you is, according to that absolute standard, 95% of people lived on what we would need $2 a day to live on then. So that's extreme poverty, right? That's much more than anything most of us see in our day-to-day lives. Okay? And huge progress on that all across the world. So that's something to be celebrated. Now, another way, you might say, well, this is hard to do. What does it really mean to live on $2? Subsistence agriculture is hard to measure, and so forth. Well, one thing that we indisputably want more of and think is good is rising life expectancy, right? So if you're living longer, that's generally thought of as being better. And what you see is, according to this incredible efforts to document life expectancy and document mortality over a number of years, that's actually easier to measure than living standards because we just have a record of when people were born and when they die, so you can actually compute average age at death pretty easily. And actually, some scholars have managed to do this back to the 1500s in the United Kingdom. Okay. And then most of these other countries, you can see kind of the data really start, 150 years ago. But what you see for the UK is really quite striking, which is among all those people who were born, they are expected on average to live to about 40. Okay? Given that you were born in the UK in 1600, we expect you to live to about 40. Now, of course, that's an average. What's happening is quite a lot of people are dying when they're young, and the people who get to adulthood maybe live to 60 or 50. But life expectancy was around 40, and it was around 40 for almost 400 years, 300 years, right? For over 300 years. So right to here, if you just look at this line, it's completely flat. No progress at all for 350 years in the UK. And then in the UK, and then every other country, rapid increases in life expectancy at birth from around 40 to nearly 80. And this all happened over the last 100 years. Right? So if you have this picture in your mind of steady progress of the human condition, that is not what we see here at all. What we see is kind of bare subsistence existence, living to age 40, high mortality rates, and then all of a sudden we escape from this in a pretty sudden way all across the world. And this is known as breaking free from the Malthusian trap. Thomas Malthus, famous author, said, "The power of population is so superior to the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man or woman that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race." And Malthus's idea was, look, there's a fixed pool of resources in the world, okay? If you have more children and more people, you're taking that same fixed pie and you're dividing it over many more people, and that's going to make living standards go down, right? Because you have some amount of food, let's say, and you can only divide it so many ways. And so what that means is you have this cycle, as we did in England, and you see this is when living standards were flat, where the population would increase because people were becoming healthier, and then something bad would happen, people would starve, there wouldn't be enough food to go around, there would be a plague or something else bad. A lot of people would die, and then the people who were left would enjoy rising living standards because they didn't have to divide the pie into as many slices. Okay, and that's the Malthusian trap, which is the more prosperity you experience, the more growth you have, the more you have to share the pie, and then the less there is for everybody. And so you can never escape. And so for most of our existence, this was the human condition. No persistent gain in living standards over time. So the perpetual tendency of the race of man to increase beyond the means of subsistence is one of the general laws of animated nature, which we can have no reason to expect to change. Thomas Malthus, smart guy, wrote this in 1798, and he turned out to be completely wrong, just completely wrong. Right? But for most of human history, he was looking back on the past, as academics often do. We studied the past. He was right, but something changed after he wrote this. Right? And of course, this is a little bit of a visual trick, but you can see the scale is linear. Okay? This is the size of the world population going up by 500 million. Right? It was very, very small, 190 million in about 2,000 years ago. Increase a little bit. We're in the Malthusian trap over here, and then boom. It's basically gone from around 900, less than a billion in 1800 to 7.7 billion in 2019. So explosion in the world's population. And the Malthusian story would be that this is a world where that's never going to happen because people are going to start to die because we can only divide resources so many ways, right? So how are we increasing the world population by a factor of 8 and actually enjoying increasing living standards over the same period of time? How is that happening? That's not something Malthus would have ever predicted, right? And you can see a measure of GDP measure of economic growth, GDP per capita. Anybody know how to calculate GDP? It's not that complicated, really. It's just you take the price of all the goods and services that are sold, and you subtract the cost that it took to make those things in the first place. So if you sell, a sandwich, you have to subtract the cost of the inputs that were required to put the sandwich together, and then the difference between that and what you sell it for is a contribution to GDP. So it's like, what is the value of all the goods and services produced minus what it costs to produce them? If that increases over time, that means we're producing more stuff. And then you divide that by the number of people to get GDP per capita. So it's like, how much value do we have in the world divided by the number of people that are in the world, right? And so what we see is an explosion in economic growth, right? So remember, just put these two things together. Malthus thought this wasn't possible. Increase in population and increase in GDP per population, right? So not only are there are a lot more people around, we're enjoying rapidly rising living standards over the same period. And this is all happening over essentially the last 100 years. Right? It's a blip in human nature and in the period of time over which humans have existed. An absolute blip. How has this happened? Well, the secret to it is something called productivity. Productivity means, how much can you produce per unit of time, right? So how much value are you creating? And what we see is that labor productivity has grown dramatically. We can only really reliably measure it back to 1950, but in a bunch of countries, it's grown pretty rapidly over this period. And then at the same time, we're also working less. So life is just getting much better. So we're more productive per unit of time. We don't work as much. We have rising living standards. We're living longer. Everything's great, right? And how does this happen? Well, let me give you a very concrete example. This is from our world in data. So the way you experience productivity growth is you develop new, essentially, recipes for how to do things, right? So people have wanted to read and transcribe knowledge for a long time, right? And so the way this used to be done was that a scribe would painstakingly write down and codify knowledge in a book. Their rate of productivity was about 0.007 books per day. If you're actually writing in longhand in a book, it takes you about 136 days in this period of time to produce one book, right? That's not very productive. And then we have this technology called the printing press, Johannes Gutenberg, and it's the printing press, right? Which is a way to automate what was a painstakingly human process before. And all of a sudden, we can now produce 2.5 books a day instead of one book every 136 days. That's a huge increase in productivity growth, right? And then we have steam-powered printing about 200 years ago, and now we have the internet where it's just almost completely costless to codify knowledge. Right? That's productivity growth. That's producing more with less or with the same. And when you see this manifest in every sector of the economy, that's how we escape the Malthusian trap. We found new ways to do things we've always wanted to do. Cheaper ways, more efficient ways. And that is the key to all of the things we are experiencing in front of us now. While I'm standing on the stage talking to you, you're here, you can take 4 years out of your life to come to college and not work and just invest in your skills and your human capital and go off to work that never used to be possible. Right? It's only possible because of productivity growth. And so what we're doing here in the university, to the extent that we are producing new ideas and new knowledge, new recipes for how to do things better, that's absolutely first order fundamental for human society and human success. Okay. And so you can see this is growth in wheat yield. So this is basically how much wheat can you produce per acre of land. That's also increased. That's agricultural productivity, more food per person, super important. And then also the world is less violent. Okay, so the annual rate of people dying due to famine, sorry, not violent. We've got less famine. Basically, we used to have a lot of people dying of starvation, and now we have a lot less. And if you look at violence, that's also gone down. Anybody know what this is? That's South Asia. This is a pretty cool paper that tries to measure economic growth using satellite imagery. So basically the idea is light is indicative of economic activity, and you can see over a 15-year period there's just much more activity in South Asia. And that's another indirect way to measure economic growth. Now you think about the technology for producing light, that's really changed a lot over time too. Okay, so this is the price of a unit of light. So this is lumen hours, basically how much light can you get, how much did it cost to get, and this reflects different stages of technological change, right? So we used to produce light. Anybody know how people were getting their light in the 1300s? That's not yet, not yet. That's coming later. That was a technological advancement. I heard somebody say it. Candles, right? Candles, you need tallow for candles, right? So light was a rich people thing then. Basically what happened was the sun went down, and unless you had enough money to afford the candles, you were in the dark for long periods of time, right? And so think about, I mean, obviously there are lots of follow-on impacts of that, but think about the productivity loss from basically having to end your day at 4:30 in the winter. And then we have this, so the reason why whaling was so popular in this period, because we developed a new technology for powering light, which had to do with harvesting the oil from whales. And then now we have the invention of electricity right around here, and then basically light is free. And we just totally take it for granted now. You can have light anytime you want it. But that was a big obstacle to human prosperity for many, many years. That's another example. All right, so why do I say all this? Why do I give you this big picture? Because inequality is a problem of distribution, right? In a world where we're fighting for survival and we're engaged in subsistence agriculture and we're in the Malthusian trap, nobody's worried about inequality, right? You're just trying to survive. And so it's important to remember that inequality is a political problem and a thorny problem because we live in such a prosperous society, right? It is in some sense the spoils of progress that we have to now argue about how we're going to distribute this dramatically larger pie. And it's important to remember that because we don't want to think about reducing inequality through means that might actually shrink the pie dramatically. So for example, one way that you could reduce inequality in the US is just by burning the money of people who have more than you. Right? And that would reduce the Gini coefficient, it would reduce other statistics of inequality, but it would have potentially negative follow-on consequences for growth. And if we want to cool the Earth's climate, probably the best way to do that is from some technological innovation that hasn't happened yet. We need to invest in those things, and that's part of the picture too. So you want to think about reducing inequality, but also keeping your eye on another prize, which is growth, which is rising living standards. Without that, all of these problems become much more challenging. Once we start to fight over a fixed pie, we're in the world of Malthus, and that's an ugly world. Okay, so now let's talk about recent history. So this is a very famous figure. Should be famous, maybe already famous, put together by the landmark work of Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and Gabriel Zuckman in a paper called Distributional National Accounts. And what they do in this paper is, all of the work that goes behind producing a chart like this is they essentially go to the national income statistics and figure out how much money have people earned and corporations earned, and what taxes are people paying back to fund the activities of government, and then you essentially try to distribute all that across the population. So you say, how much money did I earn in the private market? Then I got to pay some taxes back to fund social welfare programs, to fund local schools, other things, and you kind of net all that out, and you say, what am I getting and what am I giving for each citizen? And then you distribute that, and you say, of all the national income, who's getting what? And the process for doing that is quite complicated and was a pretty Herculean data effort. In my class, I go through it painstakingly with the students just to show them what's behind the sausage making. But here, you just have to take my word for it and note that they essentially went back to the 1960s and distributed all the income in the US across the population to compute these inequality statistics. Okay. And so what they're doing here is showing you at each year, what percent of all national income is earned by the top 1%, that's the red dots, and the bottom 50%, so the bottom half of American citizens. And what they show is that for the top 1%, the share of national income going to them went from a little over 12% in 1962 up to about 20% today. Okay? And over that same period, the share of national income in the bottom 50% went from about 20% to about 12%. So they basically just flipped. Right? Now, the total amount of national income increased a lot, okay? But the shares going to each group flipped sides. Okay? Now, what does this translate into in terms of absolute numbers? Well, One way to think about this is to do some sort of comparison across time and adjust for inflation and say, like, what does this equate to in terms of purchasing power or living standards? And what you see there essentially is that in 1980, the bottom 50% median earnings in the bottom 50% was something like $16,000 a year. And in 2014, it was about $16,200. Okay, so basically no earnings growth in the bottom 50% over this half a century. In contrast, the top 1% earned about $428,000 in 1980 and about $1.3 million in 2014. Okay, so this is where the distributional question comes in, right? So I can tell you, if you're in the bottom 50%, you're not any worse off. And these things, honestly, they're hard to measure, right? So it could be that median earnings is about the same, but actually maybe most people would rather live in 2014 than 1962. So if I gave you a choice between those two things, probably everybody would pick 2014. So maybe you're better off if you're in the middle than if in 1962. But of all of the growth in prosperity that's happened over the 50 years, almost all of it has gone to the very top. And that's a problem of distribution, right? And so the question is, what is fair? A lot of these questions are not economic, they're political. So what does this look like? So if you want to understand, like, why has this happened, I think it's useful to look across contexts. So you'll note this is basically looking at the top 1% income share across a bunch of countries. And what you see is the USA is the red line. You see that same pattern again. And you see it's much more pronounced in the US. But you see that same kind of U-shaped pattern of the top 1% income share in a lot of other countries too. You see it in China. You see it in Germany. Every country except France. And it turns out, actually, that in France, they have very high levels of tax evasion. So Gabriel Zuckman and his co-authors did a follow-on project where they looked at tax evasion among citizens of different countries using the Panama Papers. Anybody remember the Panama Papers? So they were leaked, and so they basically used that to trace out offshore wealth and found that countries that have very high top income tax rates also have high levels of offshore wealth holding. So basically tax evasion is higher in France than it is in the UK, in the US. And if you accounted for that, this line would be something like this. But the point is, you see this same pattern where very, very wealthy people are capturing more and more of the total amount of income in a society, not just in the US, but everywhere. Okay, so any explanation you develop for why this is happening can't be fully US-centric, right? It has to be, in some sense, global. So thinking about what this is related to, this kind of growth and inequality, if I had more time, I'd tell you what it's not related to. It turns out that, or I'd show you, it turns out that the black-white gap in income is big now. It was big in the 1970s. Gender gaps in income have actually declined. So women still earn less than men, conditional on working full-time, but that gap has narrowed quite a lot. So those things, while those are problems that need to be solved, they're not actually related to the growth and inequality. The time pattern doesn't really match up. One thing it really does match up is the returns to education. Okay? And you can see that here. This is a figure from a paper by David Otter in Science, where he looks at changes in average levels of real wages for full-time US workers. Men are on the left-hand side, women on the right-hand side, over time. And so each of these are separate categories. You can see the bottom line is high school dropouts. The red line is high school graduates. You've got the kind of some college category, people who have exactly a bachelor's degree, and then people who have graduate degrees. Okay? And what you see, and this is indexed to 1962. So 1.0 means equivalent to 1962 levels. 1.4 means earning 40% more than what they did in 1962. Right? It's just to make the scaling work. And so what you see here, if you just look at, let's say, this orange line, is that the way to interpret this is to say, in 1980, men with exactly a bachelor's degree earned about 22% more than they did in 1964. So this is looking at real wage growth for different education categories over time. Okay? And the punchline of this is that especially for men, although the pattern does hold for women, you see basically no wage growth at all for people with less than a college degree. Right? And in fact, if you look at high school dropouts, they're actually earning less in absolute terms than they were in 1964. And if you think about this as education being related to, you think about like returns to education, the way you want to think about this as is that the gap in income between people with different levels of education has gotten wider and wider in successive years. So there was some gap here. This is all normalized to 1. And essentially, if you think about the economy as like a ladder, the rungs of the ladder, as they're related to education, have gotten wider and farther apart. Right? And especially this is true for graduate education for men. So you see huge gains in wages for educated men and for educated women, but much more modest gains for less educated people. Okay. How big is this? You compare it to something like the top 1%. Well, David Otter in his paper goes through the following exercise. He says, imagine that you could take all of the income that was earned by the top 1%, the gain in the national income share that was earned over this 50-year period. So if you want to think of exactly what it is, you go back to this, and you say, over this period, the top 1% income share has gone from 12% to 20%. Take all those dollars. That's a lot of dollars. Okay? Add them all up, and then confiscate them from the top 1%, meaning bring their share back down to 12. Like take all that money and then redistribute it in a lump sum equally to all citizens. Okay, so imagine we did that. Illegal, unconstitutional, but imagine we did it anyway. Okay? Today, we took enough income from everybody in the top 1% such that when we took it away, the top 1% share went down to 12. Okay? That number is about $7,000 per household. That's how much you could get if we forcibly redistributed that 8 percentage points. It's about $7,300 per household. It's a lot of money. But look at this figure. This is showing you the annual earnings gap for households. So think about this as the household gap is what is the average earnings of a household where the man and the woman both have a high school degree compared to a household where the man and the woman both have a college degree. Okay? That gap was about $30,000 in 1979, and it was $58,000 in 2012. So that gap in family income by education has grown by $28,000. So quantitatively, the contribution of rising returns to education, to inequality, has been about 4 times larger than the growth of the top 1% income share. Because that number was 7,300, and this number is 28,000. Right? So it's big. You know, no one's actually doing these policy experiments, but the point is if you want to think about what is contributed in a statistical sense to rising inequality, the fact that earnings for people with college degrees have gone up a lot, earnings for people without college degrees have not gone up at all, has just been a first-order contributor to inequality among the other 99%. Like not at the very, very top, but among ordinary citizens. The fact that it's essentially impossible today to earn a family-sustaining wage without having a college degree, whereas in the 1960s it wasn't, has been an incredibly powerful contributor to inequality in the US. So a little bit on wealth. Wealth taxes are all the rage these days. It's important to know wealth inequality looks a little bit like income inequality, except it's even more concentrated. Okay, so this is the share of all personal wealth in the US that goes to the top 1%. So think about this as highly concentrated. And remember, the income share was about 20%. The top 1% wealth share now is almost 40%. So it's twice as concentrated as income. And largely that's because if you look at the median US citizen has 0 net personal wealth. You can see it actually dips below 0 here. Does anybody know what that is? Yeah, that's right. That's right. People's mortgage is going underwater. It means they have negative net wealth. That's recovered since then. But basically, the average citizen has no assets. And the top 1% has about 40% of all. Yes?
And this wealth metric is just net assets per individual compared to their liabilities?
Yes.
Okay.
Subtracting their liabilities.
Okay.
Right. So like if you own a house that's worth $400,000 and you owe a $250,000 mortgage left on it, your net wealth would be $150,000.
If that were everything.
Yeah, if that were everything. Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. Okay, so 0 net personal wealth means no 401k, no retirement fund. It means no net accumulation of assets in your house, so you're a renter or something, right? Now, we have social programs that allow for some, so like even if you have 0 net wealth, when you retire, you get Social Security. So you still get access to that. But this means personal wealth is effectively 0 for the average citizen in the US. So, one thing people ask a lot, or we talk about a lot, is why do we allow this to happen? Or we meaning the citizens of a country like the US. And if you think about it, in a lot of ways, democracy, and actually in political science, in the theoretical models in political science, they largely predict that democracy would not allow this to happen. And the reason is because of something, if you know political science, called the median voter theorem, which is essentially that policies are determined by the median voter, the person who's right in the middle on some spectrum. And if you think about like what it means, like every person gets a vote, okay? In a world where everybody's got all the money, like imagine we were a society here in this room, okay? And each of you has $1 of net personal wealth, and I've got everything else. I've got millions of dollars of personal wealth. And now we're going to vote on a set of redistribution schemes, right? So what should be our tax rate? How many brackets should we have? What should be the benefits that people get if they have less than average income? What do we think is going to happen? You're all going to vote against any policy. You're going to vote for a highly redistributive policy because there's one person who has all the money, right? Whereas if everybody had the same, if we all had equal amounts of personal wealth, there'd be no reason to have a top tax rate that was super high because it's not affecting anybody differentially, right? So if politics and votes are power, if everybody gets one vote, then you would expect that to push towards more equality. So it's actually kind of a puzzle why a democracy has so much inequality. And one possible reason I just want to draw your attention to is that it's not visible, right? So there are some characteristics of people, your height, where you can see it, right, when you pass somebody. But no one's walking around with a sticker on their head that shows you their net wealth, right? And there's people walking around every day who are part of this top 1% or top 0.1% or 0.01% and are worth billions of dollars who just look like everybody else. So the question is, in a world where it's not that salient, is that why we allow it to happen? So I want to give you the parable of income distribution, okay? And this is by Jen Penn. So he says, imagine that height is proportional to income, okay? So average height is average income. Now imagine the entire US population walks by you in 1 hour, arranged by height. What would that look like? So first you have people who are jobless and poor. They basically have zero income, and they're almost invisible. So they're this tall, right? If it were wealth, they literally don't have any height at all because they're zero. After 30 minutes, people are only about this tall, right? About waist high, so half the height of a normal person, because median income is half of mean income. So 30 minutes in, people are waist high, right? It takes 45 minutes for normal-sized, normal height people to walk by. Okay? With 6 minutes to go, people are 12 feet tall. And the height of the 400 highest people is more than 2 miles. 2 miles, right? That's what it would look like if income were distributed, if height were distributed like income. And that would be much more salient in our world, wouldn't it? If there were people walking around who were 2 miles tall. Right? And some people who you could barely see. Yes?
And is this 1971?
Yeah.
So that's like not for today.
Oh, no. These statistics are computed for today. The parable is from 1971. So the numbers have been adjusted to reflect, yeah. Maybe they were only 1 mile tall in 1971. Still pretty tall. OK, so all right, so a little bit on global stuff. I think the interesting thing about inequality in global perspective is that it really matters what concept of inequality you have in mind. Okay? And the reason is because it can simultaneously be true, it is true actually, that inequality in incomes is growing across countries, meaning income differences between the US and a very poor country have exploded. Right? So inequality, thinking of each country as a unit across countries. And then also within countries, right? So within the US, we've seen rising economic inequality, within the UK, within Kenya, within Australia. Basically in almost every country for which we have good data, income inequality is increasing within that country. So you might think, well, if income inequality is increasing across countries, and it's increasing within countries, it must just be increasing everywhere. But that's not true. That is not true. If you were to compute an inequality statistic ignoring country borders, meaning forget within the US, just like inequality in incomes within the world, that is decreasing. And the reason is because of something called Simpsons Paradox, which you may have heard of. So this is this data showing you income inequality has increased everywhere within countries. But Simpsons Paradox is basically that the trend within groups is not always equal to the trend across groups. And the intuition for this is essentially that if you have two different countries starting from different means, and one of them is increasing faster, it can catch up and it can start to become more of the global middle class. So essentially what's happened is countries like China and India have become much wealthier over the last 20 to 30 years. Within those countries, that's caused inequality to explode. It's also exploded within the US. But China is the global middle class. Okay? And so what's happened is there have been people who are desperately poor in countries like China and India. They become the rich people in their countries, which ends up putting them into the middle of the global income distribution. And so why do we care about country borders at all? If we care about human beings, members of the human race, we should say actually inequality is getting better because poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer. So here's another way to see this. You can compute basically in each country in what percentile of your countries, given where you are in the country distribution, where would you be in the global distribution? Okay, and what this shows you, for example, the US, okay, the way to read this chart is to say, in the US, these are ventiles, meaning in units of 5 percentile points. So if you're in the bottom 5% of the income distribution in the US, you are in the global middle class. So you're at the 60th percentile of the global income distribution. So even the very poorest people here are in the global middle class. And then quickly, as you see in the US, you start to get up into the 90s. So even if you feel like you're having a hard time getting by, and you probably are in the US, you're still pretty well off by global standards. And you see here in a country like China, China is pretty well situated to the global mean, right? So if you look at being in the middle in China is kind of like being in the middle globally. But then there's countries like India, which is much poorer, where even the very top of the income distribution in India, the top 5%, is about at the globe, is a little over the global mean, 60%. Right? So when you put all these things together, what do you see? This is a global income distribution in 1988. You see how it sort of fans out. You can see that China and India are pushed over to the left, and the developed world is pushed over to the right. And if you kind of add this up, it looks like a quite unequal global distribution. But if you look over time, in 2011, you could see what's happened is that India and China have become richer. So I just do this like this. The developed countries haven't really moved that much. And so what they're doing is they're pushing more towards the middle, which is making a more equal income distribution than we used to have. Right? And so why does this matter? Why is this not just a cute accounting statistic? One of the things that we talk about in the class and that maybe you've read about is the impact in the US of opening up trade with China. This is something that's in the news a lot. People talk about how the US got killed by China because once we opened trade with China, a bunch of factories in the US closed down. That was really bad for the workers in these factories, and communities were devastated, which is all true. Right? And so if one only has a US perspective, one is tempted to think that trading with China is bad. Okay? And it is bad for some people. But you have to think about, what's happened to the citizens of China over this period. The fact that China is now essentially the world's manufacturer has been great for people in China. China is much wealthier than it was a generation ago because they are allowed to trade with the rest of the world. And so how you think about these questions depends on essentially the weights you place on citizens of your own country versus citizens of another country. If you think that doesn't matter, that country borders are arbitrary, that I should care just as much about the welfare of a human being who lives elsewhere, then it's really hard to see free trade as being a bad thing, because what's happening is you're allowing people in poorer countries to produce goods that can reach richer markets, and they can become much better off, even if it turns out to be bad for a lot of the citizens of wealthier countries. So that's why it's a complicated political question. And these debates are often resolved within country borders, and so they don't all often take this perspective. But it's an important one to have. Yeah?
So it looks to me like when the distribution of income was shaped, like it was more skewed to the left or to the right.
Yeah.
So more for people. Now we're seeing that the distribution is more skewed to the left, so towards rich people, right?
To the right. This one. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's shifting more towards rich people.
Yeah.
Which we can, I guess, like in normative sense, we can argue both to be bad and a good thing, right? Because I mean, being more to the right is a good thing globally. I mean, we can easily show that, right?
Yeah.
That there's more rich people, which has like a negative stance on inequality, I guess, in developed countries because they are like following that same trend when distribution can be like more like normal, it's more toward right? Is that kind of like where we're going? That.
Yeah. So I think it's a good question. A general way to answer the question is to say a lot of the questions about inequality, like how. A lot of the implications of this kind of analysis are political, right? Because it's easy to say, well, look, everyone's getting better off, incomes are rising, but the fact that a lot of these questions about what policies we should adopt and who's going to win and who's going to lose are adjudicated within country borders and in a world where there are out-groups and in-groups and people don't view all citizens as the same, even if they try to, that's where it all gets complicated. And so I have a little bit to say about politics, but I'm an economist. I'm mostly showing you the data. I think it's important to have this perspective and to keep it in mind when we enter these policy debates about things like free trade. So I don't have an answer for you, but I think that's why I think it's important to present the data in the way that I present it, and then let the chips fall where they may in terms of politics. So okay. So I want to before I talk about higher ed in the next few minutes, I want to just sum up this earlier stuff. So again, economic inequality in the U.S. and around the world is actually growing rapidly within country borders, but you have to account for, in the U.S. particularly, you have to account for who's bearing the brunt of it. It tends to be men who have relatively low levels of education. They're also bearing the brunt, it turns out, of the decline of U.S. manufacturing because of things like the opening of trade with China. And again, inequality is increasing a lot within these countries. And of course, you have to think about what concept of inequality you have in mind before reaching a conclusion, right? So, okay, I want to talk quickly about mobility. All right, so one of the reasons that I think it's important to work on education, that's kind of my professional work, is because of the important role that colleges play in allowing people to do better than their parents or to be upwardly mobile. And so I want to just talk a little about the concept of mobility. So one way that economists tend to measure it is to estimate the correlation between father's earnings and son's earnings, or mother and daughter, or mother and son, et cetera. So what is the predictive power of your parents' income for your own income is one way to think about it. Right? And so that correlation is about 0.5. Is that big or small? It sort of seems moderate. So let's put it in context. Again, thinking about height, that's similar to the correlation in height between father and sons. So the chance of going from the bottom 10% of the income distribution to the top 10% based on this correlation number is equivalent to the chance of being 5'6" and having a son that is 6'1". Okay, so it does happen, but not that often, right? And so a correlation intergenerationally of 0.5 of income actually suggests quite a lot of persistence of living conditions from one generation to the next, right? And so another thing you can do, other than just estimating this correlation of 0.5, is you can actually, this is the Chetty and co-authors approach, is to essentially take a cohort of people and rank them based on their incomes relative to everybody else who's born the same year as you, right? And you do that for one generation and for the next generation and ask, where in the distribution do you move? Okay. So here's one effort to do this. If you look in the US based on that rank correlation, you get something like this. And the way to read this is very simple. It just says, look, if I grow up in a family that is at the median, the 50th income rank, for that among all people who are, if my family was at the 50th percentile among all people born in my same year, the prediction for me is about 50. Right? And then you can see the tilting on this is basically an estimate of how correlated earnings are across generations. And you can see there's some mean reversion. So if you're born in a very poor family, let's say the 10th percentile, you're on average going to be around the 35th percentile yourself. Okay? And if you're born at the very top, you're on average only going to be in the 68th. Partly that's mechanical, because if your parents are born at the very top, you can only go down, right? Or vice versa. So it's kind of hard to think about whether this is a big or small number. What we can do is compare it to another country. So this is the same estimate for Denmark. Okay, what you see in Denmark here is it's flatter, right? The rank-rank correlation is only 0.18. It's about half. And so conceptually, how should you think about this? It's, if I tell you, okay, I'm going to take a random draw from the population and tell you this person's family income was at the 90th percentile, how accurately can you predict their own income? And the steeper the slope, the more accurately you can predict it, right? And so a world with perfect mobility, you could actually have a world where there's a lot of economic inequality, but knowing that someone was born poor doesn't predict at all how well they're going to do. And that would be a world where maybe you have a highly unequal income distribution at the current time, but you have a very flat slope. Or you could have a world where everyone's born rich stays rich, and everyone who's born poor stays poor. And so the same income distribution, in a static sense, could result from very different intergenerational mobility processes. And I think we all have an instinct that one looks a lot more fair than the other. In other words, we might be willing to tolerate more economic inequality if everyone had the same shot coming in. Whereas if basically the circumstances into which you were born perfectly predict your circumstances, that just doesn't feel fair to people. And so I think mobility is a really interesting lever for studying inequality for precisely this reason, because it mixes the normative and the positive together in interesting ways. Okay? So another way to think about this is what share of children earn more than their parents after you adjust for inflation. And here's the kind of striking thing, is that across successive generations of Americans, the share of people who do better than their parents has declined a lot. Okay. So this is showing you that for people born in 1940, for anybody with a given parent income percentile, how many of them did better than their parents? And what you see is people born in 1940, almost all of them did better than their parents. This goes down at the end, again, because if your parents are born at the 100th percentile, you can only go down. And so it's never going to be, you're never going to earn more than them if they earn more than everybody else. It's very unusual. But what you see is because of economic growth, because growth was rising so quickly in the 60s and 70s, that was the rising tide that lifted all boats. So even if you were born quite rich, say 80th percentile, you were still about 95% likely to do better than your parents. Everyone was doing better. Right? And so what you see across successive generations now in 1980, I was born in 1979, so this is around my generation, it's about a 50-50 shot. Right? So if you're born at the median, about 42% of those people do better than their parents. Yeah.
Where does this line of like doing better cut off? Is it like at retirement you have more money than your parents had at retirement?
Good question. No, it's calculated around age 30.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, in a one-year sense. And the reason they do that is because they're using data from the IRS to link people across generations. And that data was only digitized somewhat recently, and so you actually can't go back as far as you'd like. Yeah. So what this is showing you is that, and I think that's in some sense the right concept, not so much like am I doing well in an absolute sense, but do I feel like I'm making progress? Right. Okay, and so that's really declined a lot. And the interesting thing they do is going back to our growth versus inequality discussion, is that they calculate and sort of simulate, well, what if we increase the economic growth rate, so make the rising tide, versus change the distribution of income? What are the trade-offs for those in terms of doing better than your parents? Okay? And intuitively, you want to think, like, imagine you live in a world where the income distribution is highly unequal, right? It's a lot harder to do better when when economic gains are concentrated at the top. So basically, if GDP grows up a lot, but all of that gain goes to a few people at the top, most people aren't doing any better, median wages are flat, fewer people are doing better than their parents. On the other hand, if when GDP goes up by 3%, everyone's income goes up by 3%, the same amount, more people are going to do better than their parents because you're distributing the growth more broadly. That's kind of the intuition. Okay. And so what you see is that they kind of say, okay, this is the actual 1940 cohort and the 1980 cohort, and then they do two simulations. One is, what if we, so let's first look at the orange line. What if we went back to a world where we had faster GDP growth? So right now, GDP growth is about 1.5% per year. In the 60s and 70s, the golden age of growth, it was 2.5%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a big difference as it accumulates over time. And we say, let's go back and let's magically generate a full another point of GDP growth, which policymakers would kill for. Okay, but let's keep the income distribution the same as 1980. All right, so more growth, still unequal society. What do you get? You get an increase in absolute mobility from 50 to 62, right? Which is a big increase. So you can see the importance of GDP growth for rising living standards. But then they do a second simulation, which is say, let's actually keep slow growth, 1.5% per year, but let's make the income distribution more equal. Let's go back to the 1940 birth cohort levels of income distribution. And that's this line. And then you get an increase in the share of people doing better than their parents. It goes from 50 to 80 instead of 50 to 62, right? And so you can quantify this trade-off, and you can say, well, how much GDP growth would we actually need, given the current level of distribution of income, to get up to this line? And the answer is you would need it to be about 6.5% per year. Okay, so unless you think that's possible, and by the way, no countries except during short periods of rapid growth are ever getting there. So there's just no world where an advanced economy like the US is going to get anywhere near 6.5%. What this shows you is the only way we're going to get to a world where most people can do better than their parents is if we have a more equal income distribution. Okay, so I'm almost out of time. You guys have to leave in 1 minute. Let me just tell you one thing. So I've been working on college. The income distribution, this is the income distribution at Harvard right now. About 70% of the students at Harvard are from the top 20% of the income distribution, and 15% are from the top 1%. Okay, that's more than basically the bottom half combined. And Harvard's not unique in this respect. All selective colleges have this income skew. BYU does as well. It's not always this extreme, but selective colleges in the US are highly, highly skewed towards the most affluent. Okay. And there's some, basically you can see there's more students from the top 1% than the bottom half at Harvard and many other Ivy League schools. What that means is the probability of attending an elite private college is 77 times higher for children in the top 1% compared to the bottom 20%. Okay. And given the high returns to college I showed you earlier, I think it's obvious that broadening access to college, especially good colleges for low-income students, is a key way to to distribute growth more equally. And so that's something I'm working on this big, I'm going to skip a lot of the stuff, but this big project with Raj Chetty and John Friedman called the Climate Initiative, where we're assembling data from all of these schools and linking it up to tax records to study the role of colleges in intergenerational mobility and to try to help colleges, many of whom want to do better, help them learn how to do better, to both admit more low-income students and then help them succeed. So, thanks a lot.